In the summer of 1977, two young sisters vanished without a trace while walking home from school. For decades, their disappearance haunted a small town, a mystery no one could solve. The case went cold, the trail was gone, and their father lived with one question: what really happened that day? But 35 years later, their aging father uncovered a dusty diary in the attic with one chilling line: "He was waiting for us in the woods." That one sentence unraveled decades of silence. It led to photographs no one had studied closely enough, a neighbor's memory buried by time, and a locked room that had been ignored for far too long. Piece by piece, the puzzle came together, and what began as a tragedy in 1977 would end with a shocking discovery no one expected. The house had grown quiet over the years, too quiet for a man who once knew the sound of children's laughter filling every corner. In 2012, Richard Callahan was 73 years old. His hands shook when he worked, his breath was shorter than it used to be, but his mind, though worn, was still sharp enough to hold on to the memories he wished he could forget. For decades, Richard had lived with the silence of absence. His twin daughters, Anna and Elise, had vanished on a warm afternoon in June of 1977. One moment they were two 9-year-old girls walking home from school, and the next, they were gone, as if the earth itself had swallowed them whole. Every year that passed weighed heavier on him. His wife had died without answers. Friends who once checked in had stopped calling. Even the police officers who once promised to never give up had long since retired or moved on to other cases. But Richard never moved on. His daughter's room upstairs remained exactly as it had been the day they disappeared. The twin beds neatly made, their stuffed animals lined along the shelves, as if he were still waiting for them to come back through the door. That spring, after weeks of avoiding it, Richard forced himself into the attic. He told himself it was for practical reasons. He needed to sort through old boxes, clear out clutter, make the house manageable in case his health failed. But he knew the real reason. The attic was the one place in the house he had never fully faced. It smelled of dust and old wood, the air heavy with years of neglect. Boxes stacked high against the beams, their labels faded and peeling. He took his time lifting each one, his hands brushing against forgotten keepsakes, Christmas ornaments his daughters had made in grade school, broken toys, school books with their names scrawled on the covers in colored pencil. Each object cut at him small knives of memory. Then, tucked inside a weathered box of notebooks, Richard found something that made him pause. An old leather diary, the kind a child would carry to school. The cover was cracked, the pages yellowed, but on the inside, the handwriting was unmistakable. Rounded letters, uneven spacing, the eager scrawl of a little girl. It was Anna's diary. Richard sank into a chair, his hands trembling as he turned the fragile pages. Each entry was simple, innocent. Notes about school, about friends, about what she and Elise had done that day. He could almost hear her voice as he read, high-pitched and eager, telling him the little things she'd once been too excited to keep inside. But then, near the very end, on a page dated June 3rd, 1977, the day the twins vanished, Richard's eyes froze. The words were hurried, written differently from the cheerful notes before. He was waiting for us in the woods. The penmanship wavered, as if she had been writing quickly, nervously. Richard's breath caught, his pulse hammered. He read it again and again, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. He had never known this diary existed. In all the years of police investigations, in all the boxes searched and evidence cataloged, no one had ever shown this to him. Has it been overlooked or hidden? Questions spun through his mind. Who was he? Why would Anna write that? And why on the very day they disappeared? For the first time in decades, Richard felt something stir inside him. Not just grief, but urgency. The case had been silent for 35 years. Everyone else believed it was unsolvable. But this single line, changed everything. He clutched the diary against his chest and looked around the attic, suddenly seeing the old boxes differently. How many other clues might be buried here, waiting for someone to notice them? How much had he missed, blinded by sorrow and guilt? Richard stayed in that attic for hours, flipping through page after page, studying the ink, the handwriting, the tone. He could feel Anna's presence there with him, her voice reaching out across the decades. And though he was an old man now, weary and alone, something inside him hardened into resolve. He would not let this diary be another forgotten relic. If no one else was going to solve this case, he would. What began in that attic, with a single line scrawled in a child's diary, was about to unravel an investigation that everyone else had left for dead. A trail that seemed long buried would come alive again, leading Richard toward photographs no one had examined closely enough. A neighbor's memory buried under the dust of time, and a locked room that had waited silently for decades. The truth was still out there, and Richard Callahan was finally ready to find it. It was June 3rd, 1977, the kind of summer day that settles into a child's memory forever. The sunlight spilling golden across the quiet streets, the air thick with the smell of cut grass, the sound of screen doors slamming and children shouting as they poured out of the schoolhouse for the weekend. For Anna and Elise Callahan, 9 years old and inseparable in every way, it should have been an ordinary afternoon. They wore matching denim skirts their mother had sewn for them, their hair tied with bright ribbons that trailed behind as they skipped down the school steps. The girls always walked home together, their route a familiar one, past the corner grocery, across the small bridge over Willow Creek, then down Maple Lane toward their neighborhood. They were seen laughing, sharing a candy bar, elbows bumping as they argued over who would get the bigger piece. A classmate remembered how Elise mimicked their teacher's stern voice, sending Anna into a fit of giggles. A neighbor, raking leaves in his yard, recalled the twins waving politely as they passed. The details were ordinary, innocent, the kinds of small moments that no one thought to pay attention to at the time, but that was the last anyone would see of them. By early evening, when the girls still hadn't come home, their mother began to worry. At first, she assumed they were playing with friends, but as the sun dipped lower, a prickling fear took root. She called Richard at work, her voice tight, telling him the girls hadn't shown up. He dropped everything, rushing home, heart pounding, trying to convince himself they had just lost track of time. When he arrived, the house was silent. No laughter upstairs, no doors slamming. Their bikes still leaned against the porch, untouched. Panic bloomed. Richard tore down Maple Lane, retracing the girls' steps. He asked neighbors, store clerks, anyone he could find, but no one had seen them after they crossed the bridge. It was as if the girls had vanished into thin air. By nightfall, the town had mobilized. Flashlights flickered through the woods. Dogs barked, pulling handlers through undergrowth. Police officers knocked on doors, their notepads filling with hurried statements. Neighbors left their dinners on the table to join the search, their voices carrying through the night as they shouted the girls' names into the darkness. Anna, Elise, but there was nothing. No answer, no sound but the rustling of leaves and the ripple of the creek. The next morning, newspapers printed their photographs side by side. Identical smiles, identical eyes. Headlines called it "The Vanishing of the Callahan Twins." Volunteers came from neighboring towns to help comb fields and barns. The school organized vigils. Rumors began to spread. Whispers of strangers seen near the school, of cars parked by the bridge, of shadows moving in the woods. Richard remembered every detail of that day with a kind of cruel clarity. The warmth of the sunlight when he left work. The way his tie felt too tight as he ran up Maple Lane. The sick heaviness in his chest as he realized he was already too late. It was supposed to have been just another Friday. His daughters should have walked through the front door, dropped their books, and begged to stay out late catching fireflies. But instead, June 3rd became the day his life split in two, before the disappearance and after. For Anna and Elise, the last day anyone saw them alive began with laughter. It ended with silence, and that silence would echo for decades. In the days that followed the disappearance, Richard Callahan's life became a blur of interviews, searches, and endless hours staring into the woods as if sheer willpower could call his daughters back. But beneath all of it, one thought pulsed like a wound he couldn't stop touching. He should have been there. That afternoon in June, Richard had promised his wife that he would pick up the twins from school. His job at the local hardware supplier had kept him late before, but this time he swore he'd be on time. The girls had begged for it, teasing him with smiles as they reminded him the night before. "Don't forget, Daddy." He had laughed, ruffled their hair, and told them he wouldn't. But on June 3rd, a shipment arrived late. Richard stayed to help unload the crates, telling himself it would only take a few minutes. Minutes became an hour. By the time he dropped everything and sped across town, his daughters were already gone. That knowledge cut into him deeper than any words could describe. It wasn't just that they had vanished. It was that his absence, his failure to keep a simple promise, left them walking alone that day. Every missing poster, every unanswered question, every sleepless night circled back to that one decision. In the weeks after, he replayed the scene in his head endlessly. If he had arrived on time, he would have been there at the school gates. They would have piled into the car, singing off-key with the radio on the way home. The stranger in the woods, whoever he was, would never have had the chance. Instead, Richard's delay gave opportunity to someone who should never have crossed their path. He confessed this guilt to no one, not even his wife. She carried her own torment, pacing the house at night, staring at the twins' empty beds. She whispered prayers under her breath until her voice cracked. To her, the blame was the unknown figure who had taken their girls. To Richard, the blame was himself. Every visit to the police station deepened the weight. Officers told him they were doing everything they could. Leads were followed, suspects questioned, tips investigated. But when the reports dried up, when the officers began to speak in softened tones about slim chances, Richard could feel their unspoken judgment. To them, he was just another father whose children had slipped into a void no one could understand. To Richard, he was the man who hadn't shown up when it mattered most. At night, he sat in the twins' room with the lights off, unable to face the emptiness in silence. He held their toys in his hands, the stuffed rabbit Elise had carried everywhere, the wooden puzzle Anna loved. He whispered apologies into the dark, apologies no one would ever hear. The town saw Richard as a determined father, relentless in his search, willing to knock on every door and walk every mile of forest. But inside, he was haunted by the possibility that the entire tragedy might have been avoided if he had simply been there on time. The guilt didn't fade as weeks became months. It calcified, hardening into part of who he was. He carried it into every interview, every church vigil, every holiday where the twins' absence loomed like a shadow over the table. And when his wife broke under the strain, her body weakening with each passing year of unanswered questions, Richard shouldered even more blame. She died believing their daughters were gone forever. Richard believed he was the reason. Even 35 years later, in that attic with the diary in his hands, the guilt was still alive. Finding Anna's words, he was waiting for us in the woods only deepened it. Because now, Richard had to wonder, if he had been there, would those words have ever been written? It was a question that would follow him until the end. The first 24 hours after Anna and Elise vanished were a blur of urgency. Everyone in town knew the first day was critical, and Richard refused to sit still. He pushed through crowds of neighbors, police officers, and volunteers as if motion alone could bring his daughters back. That Friday night, the Callahan home became a command post. Officers set up phones on the kitchen table, radios crackling with updates. Maps of the town were unrolled across the counters, red markers circling the routes the twins might have taken. The steady hum of voices filled the house, not the voices Richard longed to hear, but the cold, clipped tones of men and women trying to solve what felt unsolvable. Outside, the search spread like wildfire. Neighbors formed lines along Maple Lane, their flashlights sweeping backyards, ditches, and fields. Farmers opened their barns, their silos, their sheds, letting police dogs sniff through the shadows. Teenagers who should have been at football games or drive-ins were instead combing the creek bed with sticks, calling the twins' names until their throats went raw. Anna, Elise. The names carried across the night, echoing through trees, bouncing back as hollow silence. By dawn, the search expanded beyond town. Helicopters circled overhead, their spotlights sweeping across the woods. Volunteers on horseback rode into areas too thick for cars. Churches opened their doors to feed the search parties. Local newspapers printed extra editions, plastering the girls' photographs, identical smiles, wide eyes, ribbons in their hair, across front pages. The Callahan case became more than a family tragedy. It became the town's obsession. Detectives questioned everyone along the girls' route home. A grocer swore he saw them pass the store around 3:15. A man raking leaves on Maple Lane said he waved at them not long after. But no one could say what happened after they crossed the bridge over Willow Creek. It was as if the earth itself swallowed them whole. Tips flooded in. A woman reported a strange car idling near the school days earlier. Another claimed she saw a figure standing at the edge of the woods that afternoon, though she couldn't describe his face. Each lead sparked a surge of hope, only to fizzle when nothing came of it. Richard joined every search, trudging through mud and underbrush until his legs gave out. His hands blistered from gripping flashlights, his voice hoarse from calling their names. He begged officers to expand the search further, to check every farmhouse, every abandoned property. He refused to rest, as if pausing meant giving up. His wife stayed home, clinging to the phone, praying each ring would bring good news. She held the twin stuffed animals in her lap, whispering their names into the silence. For her, waiting was unbearable. For Richard, searching was the only way to breathe. As hours turned into days, the search became more organized but no less desperate. Police set up roadblocks, checking every vehicle leaving town. Trains were inspected, bus stations monitored. Flyers were nailed to telephone poles, tacked onto church doors, slipped under windshield wipers. Still, nothing. No footprints, no abandoned belongings, no sign of struggle. By the end of the week, Richard stood in a field with dozens of others, watching his dogs circle the same patch of ground for the third time. His clothes were stained with dirt, his shoes soaked from creek water. An officer placed a hand on his shoulder, speaking words Richard couldn't process, words about low odds and best efforts. He shrugged the hand away. Odds didn't matter. Effort didn't matter. What mattered was that his daughters were out there, somewhere, and every minute without them was another minute of danger. The search pressed on. Churches held vigils, candles flickering in rows as neighbors bowed their heads. Reporters arrived, their cameras flashing, their headlines screaming about the mystery of the vanishing twins. For the first time, the Quiet town of Brookfield was thrust into the spotlight, its streets filled with satellite trucks and journalists hungry for answers. But behind the headlines, the reality was cruel. Each night, Richard returned home empty-handed. Each morning, he woke with renewed urgency, only to repeat the same hopeless searches. By the end of the second week, the crowds began to thin. Volunteers returned to their jobs. Helicopters stopped circling. The reporters moved on to other stories. And though the official search continued, Richard could feel momentum slipping away. He stood at the edge of Willow Creek one evening, staring into the slow-moving water. The sun dipped low, painting the sky in orange and pink. This should have been a beautiful scene, the kind his daughters might have paused to admire. Instead, it was unbearable. Richard whispered their names, barely, audible over the sound of the current. He told himself he'd keep looking forever if he had to. But already, he sensed what no father should ever have to admit. The world was moving on without them, and he refused to let it. In the weeks following the disappearance, Brookfield became a town of whispers. Every face was scrutinized, every stranger a potential threat. It was as if suspicion itself had moved in, settling over the streets like a fog no one could shake. The police began with those closest to the girls. Richard and his wife endured hours of questioning. Where had they been that afternoon? Did they argue at home? Had the girls run away before? Detectives asked the questions carefully, but Richard felt the sting of accusation beneath each one. Parents were always looked at first. He answered with quiet fury, repeating that he had been at work, that he had promised to pick them up, but hadn't made it in time. His alibi was airtight, but the guilt in his eyes made some officers wonder. Next came the neighbors. The man who raked leaves on Maple Lane, the grocer at the corner store, the retired teacher who lived near the bridge. Each was asked to recall every detail, every movement, every unusual sight. Most had nothing useful to offer, just vague memories blurred by time and fear. But then there was Harold Jennings. Jennings owned a small general shop not far from Willow Creek. He was in his late 40s, unmarried, and known around town for keeping odd hours. Some said he was friendly enough, others that he made them uneasy. When detectives asked where he had been on June 3rd, his story was muddled. First, he claimed he had been at the shop all day. Then he said he had closed early and gone home. No one could confirm either version. Rumors spread quickly. Children whispered that Jennings stared at them too long when they came in for candy. A mother told police she once caught him offering a ride to a teenage girl. None of it was proof. But in a town desperate for answers, suspicion clung to him like smoke. Richard wanted to believe Jennings was guilty. He wanted someone to blame, someone to focus his rage upon. But even as the police searched Jennings' shop, tearing through storerooms and back closets, nothing incriminating was found. No traces of the girls. No evidence of a crime. Within days, Jennings was released, free to return to his quiet, unsettling life. And the case remained stalled. Other suspects came and went. A traveling salesman reported to have been near the bridge. Drifter is seen camping in the woods. A man in a tan car spotted by a high school student on the afternoon of the disappearance. Each lead brought a burst of hope, only to collapse under scrutiny. Witnesses contradicted themselves. Timelines didn't align. Evidence evaporated. As the dead ends piled up, the town grew restless. Some whispered that the police weren't doing enough. Others believed Richard himself knew more than he admitted. Anonymous letters arrived at the Callahan home, some offering false tips, others cruelly suggesting the girls were better off gone. Richard read them in silence, his jaw clenched, his hands trembling. Meanwhile, his wife began to unravel. She stopped sleeping, stopped eating, her eyes hollowed by exhaustion and grief. Richard tried to hold her together, but his own strength was fraying. Each knock at the door, each ring of the phone, sent a surge of hope through him. Hope that shattered when it was only another false lead, another empty answer. The investigation dragged on. Detectives rotated in and out, each new team promising fresh eyes, each one ending the same way, with binders of notes, photographs, and no resolution. The case file grew thicker, but the truth remained out of reach. Brookfield slowly adjusted to the absence. Children were no longer allowed to walk home alone. Parents held their little ones tighter at night. But as seasons passed, normalcy returned in fragments. Stores reopened. School bells rang. Baseball games filled the summer air. For Richard, though, there was no return to normal. He lived with a constant ache, a gnawing frustration that no one could give him answers. Jennings was still in town, still walking the same streets, still opening his shop as if nothing had happened. And every time Richard passed him, rage burned in his chest. He had no proof, but in his heart, he couldn't let go of the suspicion. But the police had moved on. Leads had dried up. Officers told him gently that sometimes cases stayed unsolved, that sometimes answers never came. Richard listened, but he refused to believe it. What he didn't know then, what no one in Brookfield knew, was that 35 years later, he would hold in his hands the one piece of evidence that could unravel it all: a child's hurried handwriting. A single line of truth buried in an attic. For now, though, all he had were questions. And questions were never enough. As weeks turned into months, the Callahan case lost its urgency. What had once been a town-wide mobilization shrank into a handful of detectives still assigned to the file, and even they seemed to know momentum was gone. The posters curled on telephone poles, their paper yellowed by rain and sun. The search? Parties dwindled, replaced by the hollow routines of daily life. Brookfield had to move forward. The Callahans did not. For Richard and his wife, every day felt like June 3rd, 1977, frozen in place. They ate at the same table with two empty chairs staring back at them. They lived in a house with a room that never changed. Twin beds still made, dolls and stuffed. Animals still perched as if waiting for their owners. Dust settled slowly over the room, but neither parent allowed it to be disturbed. It was not a shrine, not exactly. It was more like a refusal to admit that the girls weren't coming back. Richard visited the police station constantly in those early years. He stopped by so often that officers began to expect him. Folders already stacked on desks to placate his questions. He sat in those fluorescent-lit rooms, staring at maps, listening to lists of leads that went nowhere. The detectives grew younger with each passing year, fresh recruits replacing the ones who retired. But the answers stayed the same. No new evidence, no new suspects, no resolution. Still, Richard pressed on. He attended every town meeting where the girls' names were mentioned. He showed up at every hearing when missing children cases were discussed at the county level. He carried photographs of Anna and Elise in his wallet, pulling them out whenever a reporter or investigator would listen. His wife, however, began to fade. The first few years, she clung to hope. She lit candles in church every Sunday, whispering their names in prayer. She kept scrapbooks of newspaper clippings, building a timeline of every mention of the case. But as years passed and birthdays slipped by with no sign of the twins, her hope withered. She grew thin, her eyes sunken with sleeplessness, her hands shaking as if carrying a weight too heavy for her frame. By the late 80s, she stopped going to vigils. She stopped talking about the girls altogether. For her, the silence was a kind of surrender. Richard couldn't accept that. He watched the light leave her eyes and blamed himself all over again. The world changed around them. By the 90s, technology advanced. DNA testing, national missing children databases. New investigative tools. Richard begged the police to reopen the case with these methods. He was told the evidence wasn't sufficient, that too much time had passed. He left the station with shaking hands, his anger simmering into something colder, a determination that refused to die, no matter how the years weighed on him. At night, he still sat in the twins' room, speaking to them in whispers. He told them about the world they were missing, the fall of the Berlin Wall, the turn of the millennium, the new faces in town. He imagined them as teenagers, then, as young women, their voices deepening, their laughter still bright. It was all he had left, imagining the lives they should have lived. Then, in the early 2000s, his wife's health began to fail. Years of stress, grief, and unspoken sorrow had worn her body down. Richard sat at her bedside, holding her fragile hand, listening to her last words. She told him she loved him. She told him she had tried to hope as long as she could. But when she closed her eyes for the final time, she left this world believing their daughters were gone forever. Richard carried that weight like a stone pressed against his chest. He felt he had failed his daughters and now failed his wife. Alone in the house, the silence became unbearable. The creak of the floorboards, the ticking of the clock, even the sound of wind outside seemed to remind him of what was missing. Yet he refused to stop. Even in his 70s, long after the case was considered dead, Richard still walked into that attic, still shuffled through boxes of photographs and mementos, still begged police officers to give him one more chance. To most, it seemed pathetic, an old man unable to let go. But to Richard, it was the only way to survive. What no one knew was that time, cruel as it was, had not erased everything. Evidence had been overlooked. Memories had been buried. And in that dusty attic, hidden among decades of neglect, waited the one piece of truth that would drag the case back into the light. The cold case years had taken everything from Richard, but they had not taken his resolve. And that was all he needed when, 35 years later, he stumbled upon his daughter's diary. It was the summer of 2012 when Richard Callahan finally found the strength, or perhaps the desperation, to confront the attic. He had avoided it for decades. The stairs creaked under his weight now, each step groaning like a protest. The wooden door at the top stuck from years of humidity, and when he forced it open, a gust of stale air rushed past him. Dust and mothballs, the scent of old paper and forgotten things. The attic was a museum of the Callahan family's past. Boxes stacked high, their labels faded. Trunks filled with clothes his wife once wore. Stacks of newspapers, yellowed and brittle, their headlines screaming about the disappearance of the twins. Richard moved slowly, his hands trembling as he shifted boxes. His body was weaker now, his back bent with age, but his mind was sharp with one purpose. He couldn't let the story end the way the world had told him it had. In the farthest corner, beneath a stack of old coats, he found a small wooden chest. He knew it instantly. His daughters had used it to keep their treasures. They had once hidden candy wrappers and marbles in it, scraps of ribbon and notes passed in class. Richard lowered himself to the floor, the chest on his lap, and with fingers shaking, he lifted the lid. Inside, he found what he had not been looking for, but what he needed most: Anna's diary. It was small, bound in faded pink leather, the clasp rusted shut. He pried it open, and the smell of old paper filled the room. Her handwriting leapt from the pages, uneven, childish, filled with doodles of flowers and stars in the margins. At first, it was the diary of any 9-year-old girl. She wrote about her teachers, her friends, silly arguments with Elise over who got the last piece of candy. Richard felt his throat tighten as he read, hearing his daughter's voice in every word. For a moment, he was back in 1977, the house alive with laughter. But then he turned to the final pages. The entries grew shorter, rushed, almost hurried. One line read, "He followed us again." Another, "Elise says don't tell Dad, but I think we should." Richard's hands trembled as he traced the words. His breath caught in his chest. He flipped to the very last entry, dated June 3rd, 1977. The page was smudged, the pencil faint, but the words were unmistakable. "He was waiting for us in the woods." Richard froze. His heart pounded so hard he could hear it in his ears. 35 years of silence, 35 years of unanswered questions, and here, in his hands, was a piece of the truth his daughters had tried to leave behind. The attic seemed to close in around him. His vision blurred with tears as he reread the words again and again, trying to make sense of them. Who was he? Why had the girls kept it from him? And how had this gone unnoticed for so long? Richard clutched the diary to his chest, as if holding it might bring him closer to his daughters. For years, he had begged the police for new evidence, and here it was, sitting in his attic, waiting for him all along. The discovery shook him to his core, but it also reignited something that had nearly died inside him: determination. The police had dismissed him before. The town had moved on, but Richard could not. Not now. Not when his daughters had left him. Night after night, he returned to the attic, rereading the diary obsessively. He memorized every word, every line. He studied the doodles in the margins, wondering if they held hidden meaning. He whispered the sentences aloud, trying to imagine his daughter writing them, pencil scratching nervously across the page. But the more he read, the darker it became. The phrase, "he followed us again," suggested this wasn't a one-time encounter. Whoever he was, he had been watching the twins for days, maybe weeks. The warning, "Don't tell Dad," revealed something even more chilling. Elise had known they were in danger, but had chosen silence, perhaps out of fear. And then, the final line. That single devastating sentence that tied the whole tragedy together. "He was waiting for us in the woods." It wasn't just a diary entry. It was a message, one that had sat unread for 3.5 decades. Richard sat in the attic until the sun dipped below the horizon, his mind racing. He felt grief, yes, but also something sharper. The unmistakable pull of a mystery begging to be solved. His daughters had left him this clue. It was his duty, his final purpose, to follow it. What he didn't yet know was that this diary was only the first piece of a puzzle that would lead him deeper than he could have imagined, into old photographs, buried memories, and a locked room no one had dared to open. The attic became Richard's prison and his sanctuary. Each day, he climbed those creaking steps with the diary in hand, as though his daughters themselves were waiting there. But on one evening in particular, while searching for anything else that might connect to the diary, Richard uncovered another piece of the past, one that would stop him cold. It was buried inside a cardboard box marked school years. The box was heavy, stuffed with notebooks, report cards, and stacks of photographs from the girl's childhood. He carried it down the stairs, his knees aching, his breath uneven. He spread the contents out across the dining room table, the same table where the twins had once done their homework. At first, it was bittersweet. Smiling portraits of the girls, with gap-toothed grins, hand-drawn cards they'd made for Mother's Day, scrawled with crooked hearts. A birthday party snapshot where Elise had frosting smeared across her cheek while Anna laughed beside her. Richard lingered over each image, the ache in his chest deepening with every memory. But as he shuffled through the pile, one photograph stood out. It was a class photo, taken just weeks before the disappearance. The entire third grade stood in neat rows outside the school, their faces captured in sunlit stillness. Richard's eyes went immediately to the twins, side by side, their matching dresses crisp and clean, ribbons tied carefully in their hair. He felt a pang of grief so sharp it was almost physical. But then his gaze shifted. Behind the neat rows of children, partially obscured by the leaves of a tree, a figure loomed in the background. At first glance, it looked like a passerby, blurred and out of place. But the longer Richard stared, the more wrong it seemed. The man was tall, his features shadowed, his expression unreadable. He wasn't smiling. He wasn't looking at the camera. He was looking at the children. And more disturbingly, his gaze seemed fixed directly on Anna and Elise. Richard's breath caught in his throat. He pulled the photo closer, his hands trembling. How had he never noticed this before? He turned it over, scanning the back for notes, but there was only the date scrawled in pencil. May 1977. Just a few weeks before the girls vanished. He stared until his vision blurred. This wasn't a coincidence. It couldn't be. His daughters' diary entries echoed in his mind. He followed us again. He was waiting for us in the woods. What if this man, this shadow in the photo, was the he? Richard pressed the photograph flat against the table, studying every inch. The print had faded over the decades, the edges curling. He considered bringing it to the police, but a bitter memory stopped him. He had done this before. He had brought them scraps, fragments, hints, only to be dismissed, told the trail was too cold. But this felt different. This was not a rumor or a vague memory. This was captured on film. Night stretched into early morning as Richard compared the photo to others in the box. He looked through birthday pictures, holiday snapshots, town parades, searching for the same face. Most were filled with familiar neighbors and friends, but here and there, he swore he saw him again. Always in the background, always blurred. Always too far to be certain. A man at the edge of a crowd, a figure leaning against a telephone pole, a shadow near the schoolyard fence. It chilled him. How many times had this man been close, unnoticed? How many times had he slipped through the cracks, present but invisible? Richard pressed his palms into his eyes, fighting the rising wave of dread. The diary was no longer an isolated relic of his daughter's fear. Paired with this photograph, it was a warning. His girls had tried to tell him in the only ways they could. And he hadn't seen it, not then, not for 35 years. Now he couldn't ignore it. He picked up the class photo again, holding it to the light. He studied the shape of the man's jaw, the cut of his coat, the way his shoes caught the edge of the sun. He imagined walking into town and pinning it on the bulletin board, asking every passerby, "Do you know him? Did you see him?" But something stopped him, a thought he couldn't shake. If this man had been bold enough to linger near the school, in plain sight, where else had he gone unnoticed? What else had the town chosen not to see? The photograph had survived 35 years, tucked away in a box no one bothered to open. And now, under Richard's gaze, it felt less like a keepsake and more like evidence. Evidence of a truth that had been staring back at them all along. The morning after he discovered the photograph, Richard rose before the sun. He hadn't slept. The diary lay open on his kitchen table, the photograph pinned beneath his coffee mug to keep it flat. He stared at them both until daylight crept through the curtains. Then, with a shaking breath, he slid them into an envelope. For the first time in years, he felt a flicker of something that wasn't grief. It was purpose. He had evidence. Now, not rumors, not half-forgotten memories. Real, physical evidence. This time, they would have to listen. At the Brookfield Police Department, the walls were lined with photographs of officers long retired. Richard had been through those doors countless times over the decades, but each visit left him feeling smaller, older, more like a nuisance. Still, he pushed forward, clutching the envelope like it was the last thread of his life. The desk sergeant recognized him immediately. "Morning, Mr. Callahan," he said, his tone polite but weary. Everyone in Brookfield knew who Richard was. For years, he had been the man who couldn't let go, the grieving father who still asked questions long after everyone else stopped. "I need to see whoever's in charge of cold cases," Richard said firmly. Minutes later, he was ushered into a small office. A detective in his 40s, sleeves rolled up, sat behind a cluttered desk. His nameplate read Detective Harris. He looked tired before the conversation even began. Richard pulled out the diary first. He opened to the pages with the chilling lines, his finger trembling as he pointed. "He followed us again. Don't tell Dad. He was waiting for us in the woods. These are my daughters." "Words," Richard said, his voice shaking. "The day she disappeared. This wasn't random. They were being watched. And I missed it. I missed it until now." Harris leaned forward, scanning the lines, his brow furrowed. "Mr. Callahan, it's tragic. But it's also the writing of a 9-year-old girl. Kids imagine things. They exaggerate." Richard's frustration bubbled. "This isn't imagination. Look at the dates. Look how the entries change. She was scared. And then the last day she was alive, she wrote that. How can you ignore it?" Before Harris could answer, Richard pulled out the photograph. He slid it across the desk with a trembling hand. "Look at him," Richard demanded. "Behind the children. Look at his eyes. He's watching them. He's watching my girls." Harris lifted the photo, studied it for a moment, then sighed. "Mr. Callahan, this picture is 35 years old. The quality is poor. That figure could be anyone. A teacher, a parent, someone just walking by. There's no way to verify who that is." Richard's chest tightened. "But don't you see? It matches the diary. She wrote about being followed, and here he is, standing there. It can't be a coincidence." Harris set the photo down gently, as if afraid it might break. "Coincidences happen more than we like to admit. And even if it isn't a coincidence, what can we do with this now? We don't have the original negatives. We don't have corroborating evidence. It wouldn't hold up in court. And without new forensic material, we can't justify reopening the case." The words struck like a hammer. Richard leaned forward, his voice breaking. "For 35 years I've begged for help. I've begged you to find something. And now when I bring you what I found, you tell me it's nothing? You tell me it's a coincidence?" Harris's expression softened, but his words didn't change. "Mr. Callahan, I'm sorry. I know this is painful, but sometimes these cases stay cold. Sometimes we never get the answers we want." Richard's hands clenched into fists. "Don't you dare tell me to stop. Don't you dare tell me it's over. My daughters didn't just vanish. They were taken, and I will prove it, with or without you." He grabbed the diary and the photo, shoving them back into the envelope with shaking hands. He stood, his chair scraping against the floor, and stormed out of the office. The hallway blurred around him, a flood of uniforms and whispers. He could hear them murmuring as he passed, the way they always did. That's the Callahan man, still at it, still obsessed. By the time he stepped outside into the bright morning sun, his legs felt weak. He leaned against the brick wall of the station, clutching the envelope to his chest. The police had dismissed him once again. 35 years, and nothing had changed. But inside him, something had shifted. He was done begging, done waiting for someone else to care. If the police wouldn't help, then he would find the answers himself. And somewhere in Brookfield, he knew, there were people who remembered. More than they'd said. People who had been silent for decades. And one of them was about to speak. Richard left the police station with his jaw clenched and his heart pounding. The envelope was still pressed tightly against his chest, the diary and the photograph inside, as though he feared the world might take them from him too. The officer's dismissal echoed in his ears. Coincidence. Too late. Kids imagine things. He had heard those excuses for 35 years, and each time they cut deeper. But as he walked home through the quiet streets of Brookfield, something hardened inside him. If the authorities refused to look closer, then he would go to the people who had lived those days, the people who had been there. The town had aged with him. Yards that once held swing sets now bore garden gnomes. Neighbors he remembered as young parents were now grandparents themselves. Some had died. Others had moved away. But a handful had stayed, and Richard knew one, in particular, who might remember something. At the end of Maple Lane, a narrow brick house sagged under the weight of years. It belonged to George Whitaker, once the Callahans' next-door neighbor. George had been retired for as long as Richard could remember, a man who used to sit on his porch every afternoon with a newspaper and a pipe. He had always noticed things, small details others overlooked. Richard hesitated at the door, his hand hovering over the brass knocker. He hadn't spoken to George in years. After the girls vanished, the Callahans had withdrawn, the silence of grief swallowing friendships. But desperation pushed him forward. He knocked. After a long pause, the door opened to reveal George, older, thinner, his hair silver and his posture stooped. His eyes widened when he saw Richard. "Well, I'll be," George murmured. "Richard Callahan, I need to ask you something," Richard said, his voice tight. "It's about that day, the day the girls disappeared." George's expression flickered. For a moment, he looked as though he might close the door. But then he sighed and stepped aside. "Come in." The living room smelled faintly of tobacco and old books. They sat across from each other, the weight of decades pressing down between them. "I know this is sudden," Richard began, "but I found something." Their diary. Photographs. "I think someone was following them. And I can't shake the feeling that somebody saw more than they said back then." George's eyes drifted to the window, to the street beyond. His hands fidgeted in his lap. "It was a long time ago. I know, but you were always out on your porch, always watching the neighborhood. Please, George, do you remember anything about that day?" The silence stretched. Richard's heart thudded in his chest. Then George leaned back, exhaling slowly. "I do," he said at last. His voice was quiet, almost reluctant. "I saw them that afternoon." Richard's breath caught. "Where?" "They walked past my house, just like they always did, laughing, holding hands. But instead of heading straight down Oak Street, they cut across toward the old corner shop." Richard frowned. "The one that closed down in the 80s? George nodded. "Back then, it was run by that fellow, Mr. Lawson. Sold penny candy soda. Kids loved it. But that day, something felt off. I remember because there was a man standing outside. Not Lawson. Someone else. Tall. Wore a brown coat, even though it was warm. He kept glancing at the girls. Richard's skin prickled. Did he speak to them?" George closed his eyes, searching his memory. "I can't say for sure. They slowed as they passed. Elise tugged at Anna's sleeve, like she wanted to keep walking. But the man bent down, said something I couldn't hear. They hesitated. That's when I looked away for a moment. Just a moment. And when I looked back, they were gone. I told myself they must have gone into the shop. But when the news broke that night, I realized maybe they never came out." The room seemed to shrink around Richard. His daughter's diary entries rang in his ears. "He followed us again. Don't tell Dad. He was waiting for us in the woods." His throat tightened. "Why didn't you say anything back then?" George's hand shook as he reached for his glass of water. I didn't want to point fingers without proof. Lawson was a respected man in town. And by the time the police came knocking, I convinced myself I'd imagined it. You know, how memory plays tricks. Richard leaned forward, his voice raw. It wasn't a trick. My girls were scared. They wrote about being followed. And you saw the man. That means he was real. That means we're closer to the truth than anyone believed." George looked stricken. "Richard, it's been 35 years. Even if you're right, what good can it do now?" Richard's hands tightened around the envelope on his lap. "It means I was right not to give up. It means the police were wrong to dismiss me. And it means there's still a chance to bring them home, or at least to know." For the first time, George held his gaze. The weight of his words seemed to settle over him, and he nodded slowly. "Then you'll want to look at that old shop. Nobody's been inside in years. They boarded it up after Lawson died. But if you ask me," he swallowed hard, "that's where you'll find your answers." Richard rose to his feet, his heart pounding with a mix of dread and hope. He thanked George, his voice barely steady, and stepped back into the fading daylight. The streets of Brookfield looked the same as they had for decades, but now they seemed darker, shadowed by what had always lurked beneath. For years, the trail had been cold, but now, for the first time in decades, it was warm again, and it was leading him straight to the abandoned shop. The next morning, Richard stood at the corner of Oak and Willow, staring at the building he had avoided for decades. The old shop was almost unrecognizable now. Once it had been a cheerful place, its windows bright with displays of candy jars and comic books, its door jingling each time a child pushed it open. But after Mr. Lawson's death in the mid-1980s, the place had been boarded up. Years of neglect had taken their toll. The wooden panels were warped and gray, the paint long, peeled away. Ivy climbed the brick walls like grasping fingers, and the sign that had once read Lawson's General was nothing more than faded letters etched into weathered wood. For Richard, standing there was like staring into a wound that had never healed. How many times had Anna and Elise stopped here after school? How many times had they begged him for coins to spend on candy? And now, thanks to George's memory, this place felt less like nostalgia and more like a crime scene that had been left to rot. He approached slowly, every step crunching on broken glass and gravel. The front door was secured with rusted chains, but the wood around the frame had softened with age. Richard pressed his palm against it, and the door groaned as though it remembered him. Circling the side, he found a narrow alley littered with old bottles and scraps of paper. One of the back windows was covered in plywood, but the nails had loosened. With effort, Richard pried the board away, the nails screeching as they tore free. Dust poured out in a choking cloud. He hesitated. For a moment, he wondered if he was making a mistake, trespassing into the past, stirring up something he wasn't ready to face. But then he thought of the diary, of the words his daughter had written in fear. He was waiting for us in the woods. He had ignored their warnings once. He would not do it again. With a grunt, he shoved the board aside and pulled himself through the window. Inside, the air was heavy, thick with mildew. Shafts of light pierced the broken ceiling tiles, illuminating the dust that hung in the air like fog. Shelves leaned at odd angles, their contents long pillaged. Candy wrappers, yellowed and brittle, still clung to the floor in the corners. A broken cash register sat on the counter, its drawer hanging open like a mouth, caught mid-scream. Richard's footsteps echoed as he moved cautiously, his heart hammering. Each creak of the floorboards sounded like a whisper. He tried to picture the shop alive again, filled with children's laughter. But the silence pressed down on him, suffocating. He searched the aisles first, finding nothing but collapsed boxes and shattered jars. Then he moved toward the back of the shop. A narrow hallway led to a storeroom, the door half-rotted and hanging on its hinges. He pushed it open, and the smell hit him, something damp, old, and unsettling, like rot buried beneath years of dust. The room was small, windowless, its walls lined with shelves. At first glance it looked empty, but Richard's eyes adjusted, and he froze. On the shelves were objects that didn't belong. A pair of scuffed children's shoes, no larger than the size Anna and Elise would have worn in 1977. A ribbon frayed and dirty, still tied in a bow, and scattered across the floor. Yellowed Polaroids. Richard bent down, his knees aching, and picked one up. The image was faded, the colors washed out by time, but the shapes were unmistakable. A child's face stared back at him, expression caught between fear and confusion. Not Anna, not Elise, someone else, another child. His breath came fast and shallow as he picked up another, and another. Each one showed a different child, none of them smiling, all of them captured in the same dim light of this storeroom. Richard's hands trembled so violently, he almost dropped them. He pressed his palm against the wall to steady himself. The weight of it all crashed over him. This wasn't just a dusty, abandoned shop. This had been a place of secrets. A place of terror. He staggered back, his shoulder hitting the shelf, sending a box tumbling. It crashed open at his feet, spilling marbles, hair ribbons, and tiny plastic figurines across the floor. Toys, belongings, evidence. Richard's chest was constricted. He stared at the pile, horror and rage churning inside him. For 35 years, the town had whispered that the girls had wandered off, that maybe they had run away, that maybe Richard was clinging to something that wasn't there. But here it was, proof that children had been brought here, proof that they had been kept. And if George was right, if Anna and Elise had walked this way that afternoon, then maybe, just maybe, they had been led through this very door. Richard sank to the floor, Polaroids scattered around him, his breath ragged. His hands went to his face, muffling a sound that was somewhere between a sob and a growl. It was all here, hidden in plain sight, just waiting for someone to look. But as much as it felt like discovery, it was also terror. Because if the truth had been sitting in this shop for decades, what else had been overlooked? What else lay buried in Brookfield that no one had dared to find? Richard gathered the Polaroids and the children's shoes, shoving them carefully into his envelope. He would not let them be dismissed again. Not this time. As he crawled back out the window and into the sunlight, he turned to look at the decaying shop one last time. Its boarded windows and peeling walls looked less like neglect now, and more like a mask, a disguise that had hidden the darkness inside. And Richard knew, as his legs carried him shakily toward home, that this discovery had changed everything. The police could not ignore him forever. The story of Anna and Elise Callahan was no longer just a tragedy. It was evidence. And now, it demanded to be heard. Richard barely slept that night. The images from the shop burned in his mind. The Polaroids, the ribbon, the tiny shoes lined up like forgotten relics. He sat at his kitchen table until dawn, the envelope before him, its contents spread out as though he were laying out the pieces of his own shattered heart. This wasn't just grief anymore. This was proof. For decades, people had treated him like a man obsessed with ghosts, a father who couldn't accept reality. But now, the reality was undeniable. Children had been there. His daughters might have been there. By sunrise, Richard had made his decision. He was going back to the police. The department lobby felt colder this time, though perhaps it was simply Richard's rage hardening into something sharper. He marched past the desk sergeant with such intensity that the younger officer didn't even try to stop him. He knocked once on Detective Harris's office door and pushed it open before the man could answer. Harris looked up, startled. "Mr. Callahan, Save it," Richard snapped, slamming the envelope onto the desk. "You told me it was a coincidence. You told me kids imagine things. Tell me that again after you look at these." With shaking hands, He pulled out the Polaroids and spread them across the desk like a deck of cards. One by one, pale faces stared up at Harris. Children caught in the dim lens of a camera, none of them smiling, their eyes wide with confusion or fear. Harris froze. His jaw tightened. Slowly, he reached for one of the photos, lifting it closer to the light. His expression shifted from skepticism to unease, and then to something harder to mask. "Where did you get these?" Harris asked, his voice low. "The old Lawson shop," Richard said. "Boarded up, abandoned for decades. I broke in yesterday. That's where I found them. Along with children's shoes, ribbons, toys. Things that don't belong in a storeroom." For a long moment, Harris said nothing. He leaned back in his chair, staring at the photographs. The silence stretched so long Richard could hear the clock ticking on the wall. Then Harris stood, gathering the photos into a neat stack. "Wait here." Richard's pulse raced as the detective disappeared down the hall. Minutes ticked by, then 10, then 20. Richard sat, gripping the arms of the chair, terrified that, even now, they would find a way to dismiss him. Finally, Harris returned, this time with 2 other officers in tow. Their faces were grave. "We're taking this seriously," Harris said, sitting down again. "The items you found could constitute physical evidence. We'll need to collect them immediately and secure the scene. But Mr. Callahan, you understand this means the shop is now an official crime scene. Your entry was unlawful." Richard leaned forward, his eyes burning. "You think I care about trespassing? I'd sit in a cell for the rest of my life if it meant someone finally looked at what's been staring us in the face for 35 years. For the first time, Harris didn't argue. He simply nodded. Within hours, the shop on Oak and Willow was swarming with uniforms. The boards were pried away from the windows, evidence bags carried out in a steady stream. Forensic teams in white suits combed every inch, carefully lifting fingerprints, cataloging each Polaroid, each ribbon, each scrap of fabric. Neighbors gathered at the edges of the police tape, murmuring in shock. Richard stood outside the barrier, his fists clenched at his sides, watching. He hadn't seen this kind of urgency in decades, not since the frantic days of 1977, when the whole town had joined the search. And yet this time, there was no optimism, no promises, only the grim acknowledgement that something unspeakable had been hiding in plain sight. That night, Harris called him into the station once more. The detective looked older somehow, as though the photographs themselves had weighed him down. "We've submitted the Polaroids and the belongings for analysis," Harris explained. "DNA technology wasn't available back in '77, but today we can test for traces. Fibers, skin cells, anything left behind. It will take time, but if we're lucky, it could give us names. Maybe even match to missing children databases." Richard swallowed hard. Hope and dread twisted in his stomach. "And if my daughters were there?" Harris didn't flinch. "If they were there, we'll find out." The words should have brought comfort, but instead they hollowed Richard out. Because confirmation meant facing the possibility that Anna and Elise had spent their final moments in that room, and he wasn't sure his heart could withstand that truth. But there was something else, too, a thought that struck him as Harris spoke. What if they hadn't died there? What if the diary, the photographs, the neighbor's memory, all of it, pointed not to an ending, but to something else? Something more complicated. As he walked home beneath the orange glow of the streetlights, Richard realized he was standing on the edge of revelation. For years, the story of his daughters had been one of silence, of unanswered questions. But now, the silence was cracking. The shop had given up its secrets. And soon, science would reveal whether those secrets included the truth about Anna and Elise. For weeks, Richard lived in a strange limbo. The police had cordoned off the shop, cataloged every item, and sent the evidence to state labs. He checked his phone constantly, waiting for updates that never seemed to come fast enough. Nights blurred into mornings, his mind replaying George's memory of the man in the brown coat. Then, one evening, Harris called. Mr. Callahan, the detective, sighed, his tone clipped but charged. "We need to talk. It's about Lawson." Richard's pulse quickened. "The shop owner?" "Yes," Harris confirmed. "We've pulled his old employment records, financial statements, property leases. There are gaps, Mr. Callahan. Long stretches of unaccounted for years. And some of the belongings from the storeroom don't match his timeline. He died in '85, but some of those toys, they were manufactured after that. Someone else had access to that shop after him." Richard's grip on the phone tightened. "So he wasn't working alone?" Harris didn't answer directly. "We're still untangling it. But what's clear is this. Lawson isn't as clean as people believed. Back in the '70s, he was questioned more than once for loitering near schools. It never stuck. Not enough evidence. But now, with what we found..." His voice trailed off, heavy with implication. 2 days later, Richard sat in the station across from Harris, who spread folders across the desk. Inside were photocopies of police reports Richard had never seen. One described a complaint from a mother in 1975 who swore Lawson followed her son home. Another from 1976 detailed a fight outside the shop. A teenager claimed Lawson tried to lure his younger sister inside with free candy. Each time, Lawson denied it, and each time the charges vanished into silence. "He was protected," Harris said grimly. "People liked him. He was a fixture. Nobody wanted to believe he could be dangerous." Richard's stomach churned. "And my girls walk straight past his door every day." Harris nodded. "We've also tracked down a relative, his nephew. Lives 2 states over. When Lawson died, he inherited some of his possessions. We're arranging an interview." Richard felt his chest tighten. "Do you think he knows something?" "We won't know until we ask," Harris said. "But Mr. Callahan, if your daughters were taken through that shop, Lawson may not have acted alone. And if someone else carried on after him, there's a chance, however slim, that Anna and Elise's story didn't end in 1977. The words hit Richard like a blow. For decades, he had pictured 2 outcomes: that his daughters had been buried somewhere in the woods, or that they had vanished beyond all reach. The possibility that they had lived, that they had been renamed, hidden, raised in someone else's home, was a thought he had never allowed himself to imagine. It was too cruel, too large. Yet now, for the first time, it wasn't just fantasy. It was a lead. The interview with Lawson's nephew happened 3 days later. Richard wasn't allowed inside the interrogation room, but Harris told him afterward what was said. The nephew described a man who was strange, secretive, and controlling. Lawson had been generous with him as a child, always giving him toys and sweets, but they were never new. Always secondhand. Sometimes they bore other children's names scratched faintly into the plastic. The nephew also admitted something chilling. In the summer of 1977, the very year Anna and Elise disappeared, Lawson vanished for nearly 3 weeks. When he returned, he refused to say where he'd been. As Harris relayed this, Richard's fists clenched on the table. Every nerve in his body screamed that this was it, the thread they had all missed. Still, Harris cautioned him. "We don't have a confession. We don't even have proof Lawson himself handled your daughters. But what we do have is a pattern, a history of suspicion. And thanks to the DNA from the items you found, we may soon have more." That night, Richard walked home with his heart torn in two. Rage burned in him at the thought of Lawson, the kindly shopkeeper everyone trusted, hiding such darkness. But there was also something else, the faintest flicker of hope, because if Harris was right and Lawson hadn't acted alone, then somewhere, someone else still carried pieces of this story. And someone might finally lead him to Anna and Elise. Autumn crept into Brookfield slowly, the leaves curling into shades of rust and amber, the air turning sharp with the smell of wood smoke. Richard felt the season more acutely than ever, each change reminding him that time was passing, that answers were coming, but never quickly enough. Then, on a gray morning in late October, the call came. Mr. Callahan, Detective Harris. Sod, his voice tight with urgency. We need you at the station, now. Richard's heart pounded as he drove, his hands gripping the wheel so tightly his knuckles whitened. He tried not to think about what Harris might say, but his mind raced. Anyway, the diary, the Polaroids, the shop, Lawson, the man in the brown coat. Every thread tangled into one. When he arrived, Harris was waiting with a folder thick with documents. His face was grave, but his eyes carried a strange spark, the look of a man holding something extraordinary. We've got results, Harris said. From the DNA. Richard's breath caught. Harris opened the folder and pulled out a single page. He placed it on the table between them, sliding it forward as though it were too heavy to carry in his own hands. The shoes you found in the storeroom, Harris said. The ribbon. Even the Polaroids, some of them contained trace biological material. We ran it all, and Mr. Callahan. 2 samples came back as partial matches to you. The room tilted. Richard gripped the edge of the table to steady himself. You're saying... They were Anna and Elise's, Harris confirmed. His voice softened. Your daughters were in that shop. Richard's body went rigid, his throat thick with a sound that was neither sob nor gasp, but something in between. He had imagined this moment for 35 years, feared it, prayed for it, and yet the truth, spoken aloud, shattered him all the same. They were there, he whispered, more to himself than to Harris. They were right there. Harris leaned forward, his tone deliberate. But there's more. Some of the Polaroids had children we couldn't identify. We cross-checked with missing persons databases, and at least 2 of them matched kids from neighboring counties. This wasn't just your daughters, Richard. Lawson's shop was a nexus, a place where multiple children disappeared. Richard's chest heaved, anger surging through his grief. And nobody saw it. Nobody stopped it. There's one more thing, Harris said. He flipped another page in the folder. We tracked Lawson's movements in the years before his death. Remember how his nephew said he vanished for weeks? Turns out, he owned a cabin out near the state line. We sent a team to search it. He paused, as though steadying himself. Before the blow, inside, they found records. Journals. Notes Lawson kept, meticulous, obsessive. He wrote about children. About taking them, renaming them, placing them with families who believed they were orphans. Richard, some of those families still exist, which means... Richard's voice broke. Which means my daughters. They may have lived, Harris finished quietly. Not as Anna and Elise Callahan, but as someone else's children. We've identified 2 women, both in their 40s now, living under different names. And both were raised just 100 miles from here. The world seemed to tilt again. Richard pressed a trembling hand to his forehead. The air around him thickened until every breath felt like drowning. For decades, he had imagined death. 2 small graves hidden in the woods. That had been the only ending his mind allowed. But this was stranger, crueler, and yet more miraculous. His daughters had not died. They had lived entire lives, unaware of who they truly were. Tears blurred his vision. His voice came out raw. They thought I abandoned them. Harris's silence was answer enough. Richard's chest caved under. The weight of it. His girls, his little Anna and Elise, had spent their lives believing a lie, raised to think their real father hadn't cared. What kind of damage had that done to them? Would they even want to see him? Or would they turn away, their memories too poisoned by the past? But even through the torment, one thought shone like fire. They were alive. Alive. Richard covered his face with his hands shaking. The truth was devastating, yet it was also salvation. 35 years of silence had finally broken open. When he finally spoke, his voice was no more than a whisper. "Where are they?" Harris hesitated. Then, gently, "We'll arrange it. But be prepared, Richard. This isn't going to be the reunion you've dreamed of. They're not little girls anymore. They're women with families, histories, identities. And they may not want those identities shaken." Richard nodded, though his hands still trembled. "I don't care. I just need them to know. I need them to know I never stopped looking." For the first time in decades, the truth lay before him, raw and staggering. His daughters had not vanished into thin air. They had been stolen, renamed, and hidden, their lives twisted by the hands of a man who had fooled an entire town. And now, 35 years later, that truth was finally coming into the light. The drive felt longer than it was. Richard sat in the passenger seat of Harris's car, his hands folded in his lap, fingers twitching as though unable to rest. Outside the window, the world blurred past, fields giving way to suburbs, neighborhoods thick with autumn leaves, crunching under tires. He hadn't spoken much since Harris had told him the truth. What was there to say? Words couldn't contain the flood inside him. Fear, joy, terror, anticipation, guilt. He was 74 years old, and yet he felt like a young father again, about to see his daughters after school. Only this time, 35 years had passed. When the car slowed in front of a quiet house with a white porch and a maple tree in the yard, Richard's throat tightened. Harris parked, killed the engine, and turned to him. "They know you're coming," Harris said gently. "But Richard, remember, this will be difficult for them. They grew up believing a different story. Be patient. Let them lead." Richard nodded, though his chest felt like it might burst. The front door opened before they even reached the porch. Two women stood there, side by side. For a split second, Richard forgot how to breathe. They weren't the little girls he carried in his mind, with ribbon braids and grass-stained shoes. They were women in their 40s, their faces etched, with lives lived far away from him. But beneath the years, the resemblance was unmistakable. The shape of their eyes, the slope of their noses, even the way they held themselves, mirrored in each other and mirrored in him. Anna, Elise, his daughters. Richard's knees nearly buckled. He gripped the porch railing to steady himself. His lips parted, but no words came out. The woman on the left, Elise, Harris had told him, crossed her arms, her expression guarded. The other, Anna, looked as though she might cry, her eyes wide with something between recognition and disbelief. For a long, terrible moment, no one spoke. Finally, Richard whispered, his voice trembling, "I never stopped looking for you." The words broke whatever wall stood between them. Anna stepped forward, her hand pressed to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. "Dad." The sound of it, that word, spoken after so many decades, shattered Richard completely. He closed the space between them, his hands shaking as he reached out, terrified she might pull away. But she didn't. She fell against him, and for the first time in 35 years, Richard held his daughter in his arms. Elise lingered by the doorway, her face tight, uncertain. Richard looked at her through tears. "Elise," he said softly, "I'm sorry. I should have been there. I should have kept you safe. Please, please believe me. I never gave up, not one day." Her eyes glistened, but she shook her head slightly, conflicted. "They told us you abandoned us, that you didn't want us anymore." The words pierced him deeper than any blade. Richard staggered back, clutching his chest as if to hold his heart together. No, that's a lie. I would have burned the world to bring you home. I've lived with nothing but you in my mind. You are my everything." Elise's chin quivered. She glanced at Anna, who still clung to Richard, and then back at him. Slowly, cautiously, she stepped forward. Richard didn't move, afraid to push, afraid to break the fragile thread between them. He simply stood, tears streaking down his face, waiting. Then Elise placed her hand on his arm. Not an embrace, not yet, but enough. Enough to let him know she wanted to believe. Richard's sob tore free. He pulled her into his other arm, holding both of them at once, as though by sheer force he could make up for all the years that had been stolen. They stood there on the porch, a tangle of grief and love, as the autumn wind rattled the branches. Overhead, minutes passed before anyone spoke again. Finally, Anna pulled back, wiping her eyes. "Why didn't anyone tell us the truth?" Richard shook his head, his voice hoarse. "Because the man who took you didn't want you to know. He wanted you to think you were alone in the world. But you weren't. You had me. Always me." Elise's eyes burned with anger now, her tears mixing with fury. "All those years, I hated you. I hated the man who left us." Her voice broke, and it wasn't even true. Richard cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away the tears. "Then hate me no longer. Hate him. Hate the lies. But please, don't waste another moment thinking I ever let you go." They collapsed into each other again. And this time, Elise didn't resist. Inside the house, they sat together for hours. Richard listened as his daughters recounted fragments of their childhood, memories tainted by confusion, stories of being told they were unwanted, whispers of parents who didn't exist. He wept at every word, each detail a dagger of what they had endured. But then came moments of recognition. Elise remembered a lullaby Richard used to hum, the notes buried so deeply she hadn't thought of them in decades until he hummed it. Now, trembling, Anna recalled the smell of sawdust in his workshop, the way he lifted her onto his shoulders to change a light bulb. Small flickering memories that no lie could fully erase. For the first time, Richard saw it, the truth surfacing through the scars. His daughters were still his. As night fell, Harris quietly excused himself, leaving them to their reunion. Richard barely noticed. He sat between Anna and Elise on the couch, his hands clasped around theirs, afraid to let go even for a second. He knew it would not be easy. There would be years of pain to unravel, trust to rebuild, wounds to heal. But in that moment, none of it mattered. For the first time in 35 years, the Callahan family was together again. And Richard whispered the only words that mattered. "I love you. I always have. And I always will." The reunion had shaken the foundation of Richard's world. For days afterward, he drifted between elation and devastation. Elation that his daughters were alive. Devastation at the decades stolen from him. But while he clung to the fragile beginnings of their relationship, the police were still working, still peeling back the layers of Lawson's secret life. 1 week later, Harris came to Richard's home, his face carved with exhaustion, but his eyes burning with purpose. "We got him," Harris said, sitting heavily at the kitchen table. "Or at least, what's left of him." Richard frowned. "Lawson's been dead for decades." "I don't mean Lawson," Harris clarified. He opened a folder and spread documents across the table. We traced connections from his journals, his letters, and his financial records. He wasn't working. Alone. There was another man, a partner. He helped keep the shop running after Lawson's death. And he's still alive. Richard's breath caught. Who? His name's Daniel Mercer, Harris said. He moved into Brookfield in the early 70s, worked odd jobs, and conveniently disappeared around the same time your daughters did. Turns out, he was helping Lawson traffic children. After Lawson's death, Mercer took over. He's the reason some of those Polaroids date later than '85. Richard's stomach churned with fury. The idea that another man had prolonged the nightmare that he had kept Lawson's twisted legacy alive made his hands shake with rage. "Where is he?" Richard asked. "Living under a false name in Ohio," Harris said. "We worked with state police. He was arrested yesterday. When they searched his home, they found more journals, more photographs, and evidence tying him directly to the abduction of your daughters." Richard closed his eyes, his chest heaving. For years, he had pictured a faceless evil lurking in the shadows. Now it had a name. A man who had walked among them unnoticed while families tore themselves apart searching for answers. "What happens to him now?" Richard asked, his voice tight. "He'll stand trial," Harris said. "The charges are extensive: unlawful abduction, child endangerment, conspiracy. Even though some crimes are decades old, the evidence is damning. He won't walk free again." Richard's fists tightened. "Good. Let him rot." News of the arrest spread quickly through Brookfield. For a town that had lived under the shadow of unanswered questions for so long, the revelation was like ripping the lid off a coffin. Neighbors who once whispered about the Callahans now whispered about Mercer. How had no one seen it? How had a man so ordinary, so quiet, carried such monstrous secrets? At the trial, Richard sat in the front row, Anna and Elise on either side of him. They held his hands as Mercer was led into the courtroom, a frail old man with sunken eyes, his hands cuffed, his expression blank. He looked nothing like the monster Richard had imagined for decades. And yet, when Richard locked eyes with him, he felt the weight of 35 years of agony bear down on his shoulders. Mercer avoided his gaze. The prosecution laid everything bare: the journals, the photographs, the children's belongings. Witnesses came forward, recounting encounters with Mercer that suddenly seemed sinister in hindsight. A pattern emerged, one too clear to deny. When the guilty verdict was read, Richard didn't cheer. He didn't cry. He simply sat, Anna's hand gripping his left, Elise's his right, and let the moment wash over him like a tide. Justice had come, but it could never return what was taken. Afterward, outside the courthouse, reporters crowded them. Flashes lit the afternoon air, questions hurled like stones. How does it feel to finally know the truth? Do you forgive him? What will you do now? Richard shielded his daughters with his arms and gave only one answer. "We survived. That's what matters." That night, as he sat in his living room with Anna and Elise beside him, Richard realized that justice was not the same as peace. The trial had given him validation, proof that he had been right all along, that his daughter's suffering had not been in vain. But the real justice was here, now, in their hands entwined with his, in the laughter that occasionally broke. Through the tears, in the fragile but undeniable bond rebuilding itself piece by piece. For decades, the story had belonged to Lawson and Mercer. But now, it belonged to them again, to Richard, to Anna, to Elise. And no verdict, no prison sentence could ever take that away. Winter came early that year. Snow dusted the rooftops. In Brookfield before December had even settled in, blanketing the streets in white silence. For the first time in decades, Richard found himself sitting by the living room window, watching the snowfall, not with the ache of absence, but with something closer to contentment. His daughters were alive. They weren't the little girls who once skipped through the yard in matching coats, but they were here, women with voices, laughter, and stories of their own. That fact alone filled him with a gratitude so profound it often left him speechless. The weeks after the trial had been messy, as he expected. Anna had been quicker to embrace him, her heart seemingly eager to bridge the chasm of years. Elise had been slower, guarded, the wounds of betrayal, even false betrayal, harder to untangle. But Richard never pushed. He had waited 35 years. He could wait as long as they needed. Sometimes they came to the house together. They cooked in the kitchen where their mother's touch still lingered, where old photographs still lined the walls. Other times, it was just Anna stopping by, her laughter ringing like a melody Richard hadn't realized he'd been missing. And slowly, Elise followed, her visits cautious at first, then longer, warmer. It wasn't perfect. It never would be. But it was real. One evening, not long after Mercer's sentencing, Richard brought down a box from the attic. It was the same attic where the diary had waited for decades, the same attic where this final chapter had begun. Inside were keepsakes he preserved through the years, crayon drawings, ribbons, a school project one of the girls had made with glitter and glue. He placed the box on the table. Anna and Elise sat across from him, their expressions soft but uncertain. "These were always yours," Richard said, his voice low. "I kept them because I couldn't let go. I thought maybe one day." He trailed off, his eyes stinging. Anna reached first, lifting a drawing of two stick figures holding hands under a bright sun. "We made this," she whispered, tears glimmering in her eyes. Elise picked up a ribbon, running it slowly between her fingers, her face unreadable. Until at last, she looked at Richard, and something in her expression softened. For the first time, he saw not just the woman shaped by decades of lies, but the little girl she once was. And in that moment, he knew. The bond had not been destroyed, only hidden. Years passed. Richard aged, his body slowing, his steps faltering. But he no longer carried the same crushing weight. The questions had been answered, the lies unraveled. And though the scars remained, he no longer faced them alone. His daughters were there, sometimes beside him, sometimes at the end of a phone call, but always there. On a quiet spring morning, Richard passed away in his sleep. The world outside his window was blooming, the air sweet with new life. And though his heart had stopped, it stopped with peace inside it, not torment. At his funeral, Anna and Elise stood side by side. They spoke not of the decades stolen, but of the father who had never stopped searching, never stopped believing, never stopped loving them even when the world told him it was hopeless. In Brookfield, the story of the twin sisters who vanished in 1977 was no longer told as a mystery. It was told as a story of endurance, of truth clawing its way to the surface even after decades of silence. A story of a father's unyielding love. And for those who had watched Richard's journey, one truth lingered long after the final chapter closed. Sometimes justice comes too late to heal the past. But love, even scarred and battered, endures. And in the end, it was love that brought Anna and Elise home.